Welcome everybody to the first video of this academic year with me, Josh. I've been extremely busy at uni, so I haven't been able to pump as much content out as I did last year on my gap year. But yeah, nonetheless, we'll get right through it. So a lot of the times teachers waffle a lot, look at a textbook, and give you way more content than you need. But today I'm going to consider that and show you all the content you need for superpowers. So let's move on. So what will you get in the exam? It's a 60 marks in total in EDEXCEL, and it's usually a 12 marker and a 4 marker. So what does this mean? It's not that bad. Even if you completely fail this topic, you can still make an A star or whatever you can. But obviously, that is not the ideal situation. So I'm going to teach you all the content you need so that you have it all on lock. All right. So let's go to 7.1 then. Geopolitical power stems from a range of human and physical characteristics of superpower. So things you need to know: the factors that make up a superpower, the idea of a soft and hard power spectrum, and how you can balance it to create smart power. And three, the idea that over time, maintaining power requires soft power, hard power over time, or you need a mix of both. And you just need other things, miscellaneous things, definitions of superpowers, etc. So let's move on. All right, so the 7.1a, superpowers emerging and regional powers can be defined using contrasting characteristics, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so what I want to highlight here, guys, to you is the definition of superpower. And this is the one thing you should always do in your 12 marker, is to define key terms at the start. So here at the start, um, if you have a 12 marker about superpower, let's say assess whether or not India will become a superpower in the future, you want to define superpowers in your intro. And that definition of superpowers I always give is a nation with the ability to project its influence anywhere in the world and act as a global dominant force. Okay, guys, make a note of that, write it down, make it into a flashcard. That's the one thing you need to know. And the six aspects that make up a superpower and roughly what they include. That's what I will show you. Sorry, I messed up the wording there. But you need to remember six aspects are economic power, political power, military power, cultural power, demographics, and access to natural resources. That is what's covered in the spec, and that's what you are expected to know. So, how is economic power? What is economic power and why is it needed? Arguably the most essential part of superpowers. The money is needed to invest, exploit, and develop. So obviously, you need money for everything nowadays. You need money to build a military. You need money to invest in infrastructure, blah, blah, blah. Very self explanatory. Political power, slightly tricky as a concept, but again, not too hard. It's the ability, it's the idea of like countries having abilities within organizations like the UN and World Trade Organizations. And by being a part of these organizations, they can exert their influence on global political matters. And like, as it says here, get to their way and have a larger say in problems. And yeah, having political power, the way you can link this, sorry, before I link it, I want to say that you shouldn't look at these aspects of power in isolation. You should look at them and how we amalgamate together to create like a superpower. So yeah, when assessing, definitely talk about the mix of power, not just like, oh, UK is strong because it has high economic power. Although we don't really have high economic power, we're kind of poor at the moment and broke. But you get what I'm saying. Talk about them in respect to others, and yeah, at the same time, simultaneously. So having political power can also bring economic and physical security to nations, as more trade deals can be agreed upon, and having many allies deters potential threats. So the UK has many allies which deters attacks. So you can talk about things like NATO, stuff like that, which I will also get onto later in this video or in the next one for part two. And yeah, just the idea of just having membership of trade blocs brings power, economic power as well, through political power. Military power, very self explanatory. Threat of action can be used for bargaining to achieve political goals. So, historically, this has just basically been the USA. And back in the day, this is what most countries did. And blue water navies, this is another good key term you can talk about, is a navies with the capacity to access locations globally. And by having blue water navies, you can deter countries from exerting pressure. So, for example, using this definition or this subsegment of What makes up a superpower in military power? You can say the USA is obviously the biggest powerhouse in terms of military power. All right, now we can look at cultural power as well. So a country's way of life and ideologies, such as the American dream, can spread to other countries and encourage migration. Although I would rank this lower than the other ones, since obviously, well, what's gonna beat? What's like? How do I say this? Does military power beat cultural power? Let's put it this way: would the power of K-pop stop an invasion? No. So again, this is one of the less significant ones. So if we move on, and how we move on to demographics, and how does this make up a superpower? So the most obvious thing is just a larger population means a larger workforce for TNCs, and this assists economic growth through not only a larger market but a larger working what's it called workforce. So we look at China. China is arguably a superpower if you look at just purely on the demographics, because they have like companies don't really need to expand outside of China, since China already has such a massive market. They can just cater to within China, and this would create a lot of money, and again, contributing to the superpower status. You see how this also kind of links to economic power. So again, make sure you don't talk about this stuff in isolation. Talk about how these facts contribute to one another. And finally, we have access to some natural resources. So again, very, very self-explanatory. So if a country has more access to resources, they can generate wealth, and they can also be used as a political tool. So we look at the Russian-Ukraine war, which is ongoing right now. Um, Russia obviously cut off gas. So this is a bit of a case study. Russia cut off gas supplies to the EU, which led to widespread inflation of gas prices. Or is it gas prices? Yes, gas prices, showing how controlling resources can be used to harm economies. So yeah, and another idea of this is OPEC nations. So yeah, these OPEC nations can control oil prices as they choose what prices to set it at to ensure they gain a profit. And if finally, what you need to understand is, again, what I literally said. If you look at different aspects of power or super, or what superpower makes up, in isolation, some countries will be a superpower, but you need to look at these factors together. And some factors have more significance than others. So again, this idea that don't look at things in isolation. Economic power can lead to have knock-on effects onto political power, military power, and cultural power. And yeah, you look at cultural power, as I said before, can the power of K-pop stop an invasion? Probably not. So where would you rank the idea of cultural power in respect to military power? So yeah, definitely look at these together and how they interact with one another. It's very simple. So for example, I'll give you one right now. Increased economic power equals increased investments in military power. So yeah, and another big thing I always argued in my essays, I always argued economic power can be is the most important, as it can be used to invest in all the other factors. So yeah, as I said before, economic power can go to militaries, can go to development of industries such as Bollywoods, and again, I don't know why I'm obsessed with K-pop today, but K-pop, and yeah, we move on to 7.1b. Okay, so 7.1b. Mechanisms for maintaining power sit on a spectrum from hard to soft power, which vary in its effectiveness. So, what you need to know is power is measured on a spectrum. Smart power is the idea of utilizing a mixture of soft and hard power, and hard power is a more direct military, while soft power is more the use of more subtle political deals and trade blocks, stuff like that. So let's move on. So, what is hard power? Hard powers, in definition, is using military and economic influence to force a country to act in a particular way. And a case study that highlights this perfectly is Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, which they literally just walked in with military power and said, "This place is ours." So yeah, you can even say you can make so many links to it. Even today, the Russian-Ukraine war, as another example. Okay, now let's look at some pros. Direct, and it can project the country's intentions very clearly. So this is a direct method, a very straight to the point, no dilly dallying, waffling, whatever. However, the cons are very big. If the intended goals do not go to plan, it's very risky. And again, we look back at the annexation of Crimea, and it led to Russia losing many allies, or more recently, the Ukraine-Russian 2022 war has led to many sanctions on Russia, and a lot of companies have decided to pull out within Russia. So we can look at like McDonald's and stuff, although they have slightly rebranded, which is cheating. But yeah, a lot of companies have pulled out and decided not to sell products within Russia. Now we look at soft power, and again, it's the idea of a more subtle persuasion of countries to act in a particular way. And a good example, not it's not the best example, but it's the idea of like news channels. News channels can exert like they can push sort of an agenda onto people, as in they can not twist, but they can project news in a sort of way that follows a country's beliefs and what they think. So an example of this would be the BBC World Service reports, and they output news from a very British perspective, and this again subtly persuades people to think in more of a Western point of view. And the pros of this is that obviously it's very low cost compared to hard power, which requires tanks, drones, Lockheed Martin missiles, stuff like that. And if done correctly, it can establish good relations with other countries. But again, the con is that this is way too soft. It only works if a country has a well established, respected culture. So yeah, not every country can be effective in using this method. So we look at random, like very small countries, for example, like Tuvalu, where sinking, its cultural impact is limited, and this method may not be direct enough to persuade countries. And now we look at the idea of smart power. So smart power is a mixture of hard and soft power, and it is used to exert influence on other nations. An example of this is trade agreements and trade blocks, and this is arguably the most effective power as it takes the best aspects from both powers. All right, moving on swiftly from smart power, we look at 7.1c, the relative importance of these characteristics and mechanisms for maintaining power has changed over time. So, what do you need to learn about this? Mackinder's geostrategic location theory, and how power usage has changed over time, and how the most important aspect of a superpower has changed over time. So, truth be told, guys, this Mackinder geostrategic location theory thing, I didn't really use it. I didn't actually touch it at all most of the time. But since it's in a spec, I decided to still teach it, and I will try attempt to like make some links on what you can talk about with it. So, what is Mackinder's geostrategic theory? First of all, it's a theory that argued by this Mackinder guy that the area of Eurasia was a key geostrategic location in the world. So, in other words, if you look at this place, Russia would be the largest superpower according to this model, and this is due to it commanding a large proportion of the world's human and physical resources, and it's also protected by invasion from sea. And it argued that whoever controlled this like heartland area will control the world, and those closer to the heartland, so in these yellow areas, will become more influenced by this heartland. Okay, so you might be thinking a bit of a weird thing to talk about, but the link I see from here is the idea of, I guess, back in the day, people used to think that, what's it called? Resources. There we go. That's what I was going to say. Human and physical resources were the biggest key drivers of becoming a superpower. And you can also link this. So if you do want to do like a counter argument, for example, you have a 12 marker talking about what is the most significant part of a superpower. You could, you have a paragraph about human and physical resources. You can easily link it to this Mackinder geostrategic theory, saying, oh, also according to this model, this my point holds well, and you can say this is more important than economic power, for example. So that is something I see in this. It's a great link to make. So if you're listening to this or you're just copying down, please listen to this. You link this when talking about what's the most important power, and you can link this, and you can use this as a counterpoint, and you can use this theory to back up your point. So go back 10 seconds or 20 seconds if you don't understand what I said. But yeah, use this in your essay when to counteract your points about which powers are the most important within a superpower. Okay, now what is the influence of this theory? So again, a bit of a weird one to throw at you. It's more of like a history thing. It persuaded the USA, UK, and other European countries that Russia needed to be contained, and it reinforced the idea that control of physical resources was important. So if we look at back in the Cold War era, a lot of efforts were made to, I guess, reduce the influence of Russia. And yeah, this you can use as a passing point to further back up this Mackinder theory, saying how human and physical resources are the most important thing in making a superpower. So there you go, guys. That's how you link it. And another thing you need to know is how power usage has changed over time. So obviously in colonial times, military power or hard power was the main way to exert control. But as we've seen today, in more modern times, more soft power tools have been deployed, and mainly in the form of trade blocks and agreements. So we look at EU and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And another good one we can see is it's not exactly it's more smart power, but you can argue it's soft power. It's more like trade, what's it called, tariffs on Chinese electrical vehicles in America. They've tried to limit a lot of Chinese EVs into the American market, and yeah, that's an example of using more soft power to, I guess, reduce the effect of rising superpowers. But the one thing you need to know is that although we are in a period of smart or soft power, and hard power exists to this day, so not so recent, but the USA Iraq 2003 invasion is a clear example, and the 2020, obviously the Russian Ukraine war is another example. And now we move on to 7.2. So it's the patterns of power and how have they changed over time. So things to understand: uni by multipolar world, and we need to look at the British Empire as a unipolar, what's called unipolar power case study. Neocolonialism as another case study of, I guess, it's more of a indirect control as highlighted by 7.2b, and how different patterns of power have different risk level associated with it. And the main takeaway I want you to take over or take home is that over time, strategies to maintain power have changed from hard to soft power, or hard to softer power. That should be the better word, because smart power is the main thing that's being utilized today. And it's the idea of colonialism shifting. Although colonialism, I guess, in some ways still exists today, it's shifting to this idea of neocolonialism, which means new colonialism. And I'll get into that later. So, moving on swiftly, we're going to talk about the next part. So, before I get on to that next part, we're going to look at a great keyword to use in our essay: sphere of power. So, what does this mean? It's the idea that a nation's power reaches out towards a certain area and ends at a certain area. Although, realistically, your power is dotted everywhere, you can imagine it like a sphere to simplify it. And it's the idea of a nation's reach of influence. And what I like to imagine is if you get a compass and then you put your compass on your country and just draw a perfect circle around it. And that perfect circle represents what where the country's reach or influence ends. So yeah, it's a great keyword to use in 12 markers. Use it. As soon as the examiner sees you sphere of power, they'll be like, wow, this guy knows his stuff. And I might just mark him more leniently, or I'm just going to see this person, this essay, in a different light. This man is a genius at geography. So, yeah, definitely use it. And let's move on. So, patterns of power. We can look at the different patterns of power, and there's different case studies for them. So, unipolar world, what does that mean? It means one power or one nation, aka a hyperpower, dominating and controlling the world. Think British Empire and how at one point they had around 24% of global land. That is an example of unipolar world. No one else came close to the British Empire. And the second one is bipolar world. So bi to polar, you understand. So two dominant countries competing against each other. So think Russia versus USA during the Cold War era, or more recently, we're looking at China versus USA competing for the superpower status. And now we look at multipolar world, and I guess you can say it's happening today. So it's the idea of many countries competing for the top spot. So think about the rise of BRIC nations, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South America in the 21st century. And you can just talk about the decline of USA. Also, yeah, I would say it's pretty recent. Multipolar world, you can argue the world is in a bio or multipolar world at the moment, but this is a lot of times due to the decline of the US in the 21st century. And again, these are just great key terms to throw into 12 markers to flex your knowledge, as I mentioned here with the sphere of power. So let's move on to the maintenance of power in the imperial era. We can look at the British Empire. Uh, so yeah, we'll go through how colonialism works and its definition, how the British Empire maintained its empire, it's a massive case study through a more direct hard power approach. Okay, let's move on. So, what is colonialism? So, in an exam, if you were asked about, for example, 12 marker, how colonialism worked, the exam definition is the acquisition of political control over a territory by another country and the subsequent settlement of that territory. So, imagine you watch probably like, what's those games called? Kingdom War, War of Kingdom, stuff like that. I forgot what it's called. As soon as you overtake one country, you start overtaking different ones, and yeah, it's just like building a Clash of Clans base if you think about it. The more loot you get, the more you can upgrade your cannon, upgrade your mortar, upgrade your barbarian king or arch queen. And I'm waffling now, but it's just a more direct control of countries via political influence, and this is a form of hard power that involves military invasion. So here's a graphic I showed you here. Not graphic, I didn't make it, but painting, I guess. And yeah, and some strategies used for colonialism include the imposition of an alien legal system. So we can look at this. Not great. This is a bad word. It's not a great thing, but a very clear example of the imposition of an alien legal system is the Belgian colonization of Rwanda and how it placed the Tutsi people above Hutu people, which obviously led to the outbreak of the Civil War. And yeah, it's the idea of divide and conquer. And the government also dictated through colonial admins, so people, those district commissioners in Kenya from the British Empire, and cultural imperialism. So the British Empire is often credited for bringing the idea of like Christianity to many African colonies and countries, and to this day, a lot of African countries are very heavily Christian. And these are things you can use as case studies if you're asked about colonialism or hard power, or just like passing comments, I would say. And here we are now with the British Empire case study, and the four things it used to maintain its power was obviously colonialism and direct control, transoceanic cables, military garrisons, and controlling major trade routes. So I don't know if you look here about what you need to know, but these are just a few mechanisms they used to control the world, well, not the world, but empire. And we're going to look at transoceanic cables first and how it helped maintain the British Empire. So they had a lot of well-connected cables allowing for efficient communications in the oceans. And examples of these were cables are connected from UK to all major continents in areas like Canada, India, Hong Kong, Egypt, and New Zealand. And this is actually what I did in my. If you look at this graphic here, this is what I did in my classwork probably like 2+ years ago now. And this basically represents all like the cable lines that um, the British Empire had. And by doing this, I guess you can do more efficient, what's it called, efficient trade, efficient communications. And as you can see here on the slide, you can waffle about this being good for controlling trade or helping in communicating about potential attacks. So yeah, it's your world. You do what you want with this information, but this is how I would say. This is what I would say. All right, next one, military garrisons. So these are just literally just military posts placed in different continents to counteract potential invasions. So again, there's a pattern here, guys. Can you not see where the UK have base? It's all India, Hong Kong, etc., etc. They just based in these countries to maintain larger areas of Asia, and these military posts also help prevent potential invasions or deterred invasions from other countries. So that obviously helped maintain their power. And another one, big one, I like this one the most. I talked about it a lot. It's the large control of the world meant very efficient trade of goods. And one of the best things they probably did, or best things to do, I don't say it's not the best thing, sorry, apologies. Wrong wording again, not the best. The most effective thing they did was controlling a large amount of Africa, which meant that the empire had access to the Suez Canal, giving access to Asia. I don't know if you remember, a couple years ago, the Suez Canal got blocked, and I'm pretty sure this led to a few, I guess, trade shortages. Not trade shortages, but trade problems. So this route, if you can see here, this is the Suez Canal. I'm gonna zoom in here. Um, right through here, it literally gives a very fast access towards Asia, and as a result, it's really good. So let me just go back, and yeah, it gives large control to Asia. So again, great trade routes means more spreading, more trade, which increases economic power. There you go, another link. And now we move on to, I believe, 7.2b. Yep, and this is yeah, I'll discuss it later. Alright, so 7.2b, multifaceted indirect control, including neocolonialism mechanism, has become more important. Okay, so you need to understand that in today's world, colonialism does not slide anymore. You can't just invade a country and take over completely. That is not how the world works anymore. So, what has this meant for the world? So, obviously, countries still want to exert control over other countries, and they have done this through neocolonialism, and I'll explain what that means later exactly. And you need to have a deep understanding of like the mechanisms of neocolonialism. So things like yeah, political neocolonialism, economic neocolonialism, and yeah, I will get on with it. So what exactly is neocolonialism? So in an exam, all you need to know is that it literally means a new colonialism. And the idea is that yeah, using trade, investment, culture to influence independent countries instead of direct governance. And it's the idea of using this indirect control over countries rather than direct control. So again, it's the same goal as colonialism. It's trying to take control of countries, but it makes them look better since you're not actually like imposing any illegal or not illegal alien legal systems. So the three main ways neocolonialism, my tongue's getting twisted there, are through aid, debt, and trade. So, how does aid today contribute to neocolonialism? So, aid is obviously given to allies who the superpower want good relations with, and a lot of this aid is tied aid. So, we talk about this a lot in health and human rights, if you ever do it, but a lot of superpowers want to be paid back for this aid, and as a result, receiving countries are in debt. So, by putting countries in debt, superpowers can manipulate countries receiving aid and to like accept really bad terms of conditions or like contract. So imagine I give you a contract where I want 90% of everything you earn after you graduate. That is a terrible contract. You're not going to take it. But some countries are so poor or so low income that they have no choice but to accept the aid. And a key example of this, which I discussed also in my globalization video, which you should watch, is the IMF provide loans to developing countries, but a receiving country must agree to run a free market in a lot of the cases. So what this essentially showing is that countries have to allow other countries to invest in it, and obviously this is very advantageous for the superpower. So yeah, that is just one way of exerting control. Make sure you note it down, and this idea of manipulation. And how does debt lead to neocolonialism? So this is also very similar to aid, but what you need to know is that debt channels loans from developing to developed world, which increases inequality. And what I like to say in my essays, which I forgot to put here, is the idea of polarizing inequalities. So by causing a power difference, this causes by causing power differences to increase, superpowers gain control over the vulnerable, and a key case study for this would be the debt relief schemes, such as heavily indebted poor countries. So these HIPC schemes are still exerting country over control over the poorest. And again, to qualify for such schemes, developing countries must follow the policies of the superpowers, which again are very manipulative and very in favor of the superpowers. And finally, we have trade. So today, the whole world often runs on a Western free trade ideology, and this is exerted, or this is how to say it, enforced by NGOs or organizations such as the World Trade Organizations, and these organizations are often dominated by the USA and the EU, and and also the main stock markets run on this Western free trade ideology. And as a result, superpowers use TNCs to manipulate countries to follow trade agreements. So, example of this is a very popular one. So, the Chinese economy was westernized in 1978. If you don't remember the open door policy, where they allowed free trade and investment, and this attracted TNCs, allowing Western powers to exploit cheap wages. So, we talk about a lot of factories in China producing cheap goods, like Temu, AliExpress, stuff like that. And this subtly influences countries. And as again, you can see this within China, where they open up their markets. Okay, so moving on, we're going to move to 7.2c. Different patterns of power bring varying degrees of geopolitical stability and risk. Very self explanatory, so let's move on to what you need to know. So, you just need to know the idea of how stable different worlds are. So, we look at a unipolar world, which is a hyperpower. It's often said that it's hard to maintain influence and control, and can be hard to control rogue groups opposing a superpower. So, whilst yes, you control a lot of the world, the mechanisms for controlling the world, or sorry, controlling what you influence, is very hard when there's only one superpower in the world. Yeah, so that's a bit waffly, but again, it's very self-explanatory. Bipolar world, you can argue to be more stable than a unipolar world. So you think about today's world, it's always the debate of China versus USA, who's the bigger superpower. And the big thing you need to know, it really depends on communications between countries, and also the idea of a multipolar world with the rise of BRIC nations. And it's arguably less stable than the uni or bipolar world due to every nation aiming for the top spot. So imagine everyone has the same goal of being the best, then obviously there's going to be a bit of conflict going on. And what you also need to know is there are very complex relationships that creates fears over alliances. And that is pretty much what you need to know for this. So just remember some key points about it. Different patterns of power have different things called different degrees of risk associated with. And now we move on to 7.3, so emerging powers varying by influence on people and the physical environment, which can change rapidly over time. So, to summarize what you need to know here, you need to know about emerging powers. You need to know the exam definition of an emerging power, which is a great, again, for a 12 marker. And this is nations with the potential to become a big influence on the global stage. You see, very simple, but very easy thing to forget when you're on an exam. Just define key terms, guys. That's the biggest thing you need to take away. And then you also need to know the strengths and weaknesses of certain emerging powers and different development theories. So this is going to be quite a long one, but here we go. So let's move on to 7.3a. So, a number of emerging countries, including Brazil, BRIC nations, and other G20 members, are considered increasingly important in the global economic and political systems. So, you need to know what BRICS are, and G20 are. So, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China. G20, an international forum for the world's 20 largest economies. And these countries are closing the gap to becoming actual superpowers. And the emergence of these nations, the BRIC nations and G20 nations, is mainly due to the decline of European countries. So we look at like UK, for example. UK have fallen off so hard since the World War, so post-war era. And USA, although it doesn't seem like it, or you don't really think about it, the USA's economic growth has slowed since 1990. And the biggest role you need to know about is that's causing this is the manufacturing industries moving from the US towards Asia in what is known as a global shift. Watch my globalization video if you don't know what that is. And these emerging powers are playing a bigger role politically. So BRIC nations and other emerging powers have been more present in agreements, such as the Paris Agreement, another very famous one. But yeah, that's what you need to know. And you need to know this case study. So again, you need to know about emerging powers. And one of the questions you could get is explain how emerging powers can assess the statement. Right, what's it called? Assess the statement that emerging powers have the ability to, I don't know, overtake superpowers, something along the lines of that. And a good case study of this would be the rise of China and how they used economic reforms to become an emerging power, to shift from not being an emerging power to an emerging power. So, the key things you need to know: in 1950, the shift from a Marxist to a socialist economy helped increase economic growth. And this is further exacerbated by the 1978 open door policy, which allowed for more investments to be made, obviously, so more FDI, another key term, foreign direct investment. And as a result, China's average growth is 10% annually for the last 25 years. So big numbers. And you also need to know that China exports over 200 billion more products and services to the US than it imports. So you can see there's inequality in trade. So they're trading a lot more to US than US is trading to them. So that's something to note down. And then another thing that helped the rise of China is obviously the military expansion. So what another thing you need to know is in 1997 they adopted a new strategic concept of high tech and computers to carry out basic military operations, and they have a massive budget for the military, being $216 billion in 2015. These statistics are very outdated since, if you look, this is taken from the textbook if I remember correctly, and these textbooks were made in 2016. So just bear that in mind. This might have increased or decreased, but it's still a large number nonetheless. And another thing you can link this to is how China has been expanding their influence or dominance in the Pacific Ocean. As you can see, what they're trying to do in Taiwan in 2022 and stuff like that. So you need to know how China have adopted new military strategies to, I guess, expand their influence. Military advancements have allowed China to expand beyond the Western Pacific. So they opened their first military logistics base in Djibouti, I believe, in 2015 as well. So you can see how the rise of China can be attributed to increasing military influence. And I guess people are taking them more seriously nowadays, which is very prevalent today with a lot of sanctions, not sanctions, on like bans on EVs and whatnot, tariffs. Okay, now we move on to the political influence and how rising political influence of China has helped it become an emerging power. So, China have actually taken a leading role in the G20 nations to respond to financial crisis, and they also have become a key broker with North Korea with rising threats. So, imagine North Korea doesn't speak with anyone, so you have to go through China to speak with them. So, then again, you're giving China a platform, and I guess a lot of countries have to tread lightly along the waters of China so they don't offend them because they're allied with North Korea. And yeah, they've just increasingly become more increasingly influential in other Asian countries. And this is taken from the globalization section, but you can link it back. So Credit Suisse in 2016 conducted a study, and they said that 30% of FDI in Thailand and 44% of FDI in Cambodia was from China. So again, they invest a lot in other countries as well. So they're creating a reliance and therefore allies and alliances. And another small thing to note is a demographic power I've mentioned before. So China's population is around 1.4 billion, large labor force and military. So again, more labor equals more income, more taxable income, and what else? It creates a bigger job market, creates more just industries in general, and more people working in these industries, pumping the money in, and also a bigger military, which can be used to invade and I guess showcase their power. And you need to know how the rise of China, although I've mentioned all of these in a positive light, you need to also mention how these have not always worked out. So these factors have also helped China rise, and they can also be a weakness to China. So let's see how the economic reforms I mentioned earlier have become a downfall for China, and why perhaps these same factors making them an emerging power, are the same ones not making them into a superpower, if that makes sense. So, yeah. So China is sort of in the middle, not in the middle, but I would say leaning towards superpower. But there are some things as to why they haven't become fully a superpower. And we can look at the economic reforms, and we can see how China's GDP per capita is still only 10% of the US's, despite being arguably the US's biggest rivals in this current world. And it shows a uneven wealth spread. And yeah, so only the top people within China are actually the ones making the money. And we need to talk about the state-run ownership of the economy. So whilst yes, it's good that the government is getting this money channeled in, they do the state-run ownership does generate a massive debt levels for the government, since you need to take out loans for businesses. It costs a lot. So yeah, there's massive debt levels for the government as well, which can also be a downfall of China. Perhaps you can link the massive debt levels as to why there's uneven wealth spread. Perhaps there's not enough money due to the debt to reinvest back into the social welfare of people. So yeah, you can just make these little points, little links. It doesn't have to be exactly, how do I say it? It doesn't have to be. You don't have to have it in an actual case study to mention it. You can just link it like this, stuff like that. And another downfall of the demographic within China is that China has an aging population, and as you can see today, we can compare this to India, which has the second very large population as well. And so you can see how China in the future will have a smaller workforce slowly, and it's going to be overtaken by India, who have a lot younger not migrants, younger people, and younger working age people. So to highlight this again, the median age of people in China in 2015 was 35.2 years compared to India with 27.5. So again, showing how India's workforce and I guess talent pool is a lot younger, so there's more potential in that sense. They have more time. And by 2020, this is a very bad statistic, again, taken from an old textbook, but you can say it was projected by 2020, 12% of Chinese people will be over 65. And retirement age is set at 51. So again, link it, lots of elderly to support, a lot of people claiming social welfare, especially old people, pension schemes, stuff like that. So it's very costly to support a lot of old people. So yeah, that could be a downfall you can mention as to why China isn't going to become a superpower within the next 20 years or 10 years. So yeah, moving on. We can also talk about how some emerging powers in depth, and we need to talk about in general their strengths and weaknesses in this section. So we're gonna move on to that. Okay, so within this one, I'll focus on China, India, and Brazil. China, I've already spoken about a lot, but here are just some little stuff to note down in your mind. I won't read it out, so just pause it and read it. Here you go. India's with its strengths and weaknesses, Brazil with its strengths and weaknesses. And now we move on to development theories. And this is a great way in your 12 markers to link back to a theory or make it like a, what's it called, synoptic link. That's what examiners love. They love when you use every part of your knowledge. And yeah, most people tend to forget this part. So definitely learn these theories and how, I guess, in the 12 marker, if it asks you where how would you, for example, assess the extent to which, let's say, USA is a superpower? You can always link it to one of these models and say stuff like, using Rostow's modernization theory, it is clear that USA is a superpower. But yeah, so yeah, I'll just go through a few of these and yeah, again, I'll give you more key points and show how these theories can be used to explain how emerging powers can become superpowers. So Rostow's modernization theory. This you've probably done in GCSEs, very tedious. Okay, so TLDR, this is a model that argues that countries need to meet certain prerequisites to develop, and they have to go through the 5 stages to go from developing to developed. So it's a very linear model, as you can see, and I will talk about the weaknesses of this model later. But this is essentially each stage. So you have traditional society. So imagine people just farm for their own needs only, and then preconditions for takeoff. So farming is sort of shifting. They're using the farming economy's income to build on infrastructure, and then takeoff is where most emerging powers are when manufacturing industries have been introduced and causing rapid growth, which leads to more investments and better infrastructure. And when you have drive to maturity, new ideas and tech, that's the main part. Remember, tech for drive to maturity. And number five, high mass consumption. So countries have reached a superpower status or a developed status. And yeah, this is a very linear model again. And just to link it back, what you could do with the model would be like, oh, as of right now, China might be between stage 3 and 4 or stage 4. Whereas the USA, you could argue, might be stage 5. But this is all subjective, so you can argue it how you want in the exam, and you can just make a little point about this. So let's move on to Frank's dependency theory. So Frank's dependency theory consists of a periphery and core, and what the periphery regions are. So that are the outer regions. Think like Hunger Games. We have like the capital and the other districts. The periphery region provides services to the core countries. So we think about how, let's say, cheap goods, for example, oil, copper, coffee, blah, blah, blah. And in return, sorry, so the periphery provides cheap goods and a market for goods from the core regions. And in return, the core regions provide aid and goods to the periphery regions. So there's like a little, what's it called, interaction or relationship going on where the periphery provides goods and both sides give resources back. But core countries control the development of the periphery by setting prices of goods and interfering with economies via things like the IMF and the World Bank, which I discussed earlier, how these core regions can limit the development of the periphery through policies. And the core uses military aid to buy loyalty of the periphery. So again, just to sum it up, it's literally just a relationship between developing and developed countries. And it's the idea that these regions are polarized, so there's no movement in Frank's dependency theory. So you can't move from periphery to core, core to periphery. And yeah, this model argues that these roles are set within society, which I will discuss again in the weaknesses of this model. And yeah, so we move on to a very similar one called Wallenstein's world system theory. So what this shows, as you can see, the arrows, is that there's a middle ground between the core and periphery, named the semi-periphery. So this is obviously a more accurate model if you put it this way, because no country, if you look at Frank's dependency, there's only a periphery and core, which, again, to define countries into two categories, very bad. But here adds a third category, which you can argue makes it better, and it's the same. So the periphery regions rely on core countries to export raw materials and are forced into unequal trade patterns. And it also argues that the relationship between superpowers and other nations follow a neocolonialist relationship. So, how I'd like to explain it, Frank's dependency with extra steps. But yeah, just make a mental note of it. You don't actually have to know these like inside out. You can just name drop it and be like, using one size world system theory, it's clear that China or India is in a semi-periphery region since it's relying on aid from blah 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 XXX stuff like that. So let's look at criticism of Rostow's modernization theory. Again, might not need it in the exam, but good to mention it. So in a counterpoint, it describes the process of economic change. Mainly, it does not help in understanding how countries gain political or cultural power. And within this model, socialist and communist countries like the USSR or China are not expected to develop without this model. Okay, so moving on, we look at Frank's dependency theory and its criticisms. So, again, as I mentioned before, it suggests that countries are permanently stuck in an underdeveloped state and there is no movement, as you can see, between a periphery becoming a core region. So it argues that roles are set. So, and a great example or counterexample of this are NIC, so countries like South Korea, Singapore, And yeah, but the one thing you can argue about this is that these countries have also received help from the USA, so it kind of proves Frank's dependency theory, but at the same time, it doesn't. And finally, we move to the Wallerstein sort of system theory, and here's some what's it called criticisms. So the semi-periphery countries are catching up, but again, this model also suggests that the roles are set, and the theory analyzes power rather than explaining it. And using the semi-periphery logic, China and Brazil are on the same level economically or as a superpower, but this is not the case. So you can make the same criticisms or the dependency theory. It just puts countries together that should not be together, and it doesn't really go into detail of how they define a periphery or semi-periphery. So is it defined by military power or economic power? We don't know. So that's something you can criticize. And here we move on to how superpowers have a significant influence over the global economic system, and the things you need to know: how superpowers control the global systems and how they control the. So here we have things you need to know. So one, how they control the economy through IGOs, so intergovernmental organizations. How superpowers use TNTs to further influence the economy, and global cultural influence as a way of increasing influence. So, well, skipping anything, let's go through all of these. So what you need to know for 7.4a are IGOs, and you need to know the case studies of the World Bank, IMF, World Trade Organization, WEF, and how they influence the global economy. So let's look at the World Bank first. So their role is to finance the development of countries with loans from developed countries. Very simple. You've probably done this before. And how superpowers control people or countries with this is that countries or developing countries receiving loans can be manipulated to follow rules and regulations set by superpowers exerting their power. So yeah, again, it's what I mentioned before. They give aid, but at the cost of everything. And over 40% of votes are given to the 8 largest contributors, which keeps superpowers in control of the economy. So there's an uneven distribution of voting. You can't really call it a democracy. And again, richest people can dictate what happens over the economy. And now we move on to the IMF. So again, the role to stabilize global currencies and loans to countries in debt. And yeah, again, very similar to the World Bank. Between 1980 to 1999, IMF imposed conditions for borrowing countries, which caused cuts in social spending. So again, it shows how the IMF can influence countries to cause cuts in social spending and spend more on developing the economy, which is great if you want to invest in the country, but bad if you actually live in the country. And again, similar to the World Bank, the voting rights within the IMF are proportional to investments. So if you remember back to the G20, so 20 most advanced economies, they have 70% of all voting rights, which means that the IMF is a way to maintain superpower status rather than to elevate the status of emerging powers. And World Trade Organization, again, you learn about this probably, but they work to remove barriers to international trade. And they have negotiated a sequence of global free trade agreements that have gradually removed trade taxes and quotas. And again, in general, TLDR, it promotes free trade, which is a Western ideology, further pushing the superpower, mentality or mindset onto the economy. And finally, we have the WEF. So this is the World Economic Forum. It's a Swiss non-profit organization that acts as a discussion forum for businesses, politicians, and IGOs. And they discuss pro-trade and pro-TNC policies, which grows the influence of the free market and Western ideology, which further promotes or increases the power of Western superpowers. And yeah, again, the idea is that these Western powers are trying to grow the power through their ideologies. Okay, so now we move on to 7.4b, and this is the idea of TNCs and patents, and how TNCs are dominant economic forces in the global economy, and how they assert this power through patents. So, what are patents? They are exclusive rights for an invention along with the rights to sell them. And how this exerts power is that an example case study would be Apple. They have patents to sell their products, and this allows them to choose who can sell and buy their products, and it ensures cultural globalization and controls the spread of a country's influence. And again, the World Trade Organization enforces patent rights. So through the use of patents, you can spread culture and again, cultural ideology, things like that, a way of life. Although it's not the greatest thing in displaying power or superpower status, it is a more subtle way, but it's still a way of controlling the economy. And very short one, we need to talk about how global culture also influence power and how it's linked to economic influence and tech. So, what you need to know is that TNCs are the main drivers of cultural globalization and westernization, and the top 10 companies were American in 2016, including Google, Apple, and Microsoft. And within these companies, their values are also portrayed. So, a lot of these, if you see their adverts, they always talk about individual freedom, the idea that consuming goods is a good life. So again, it's the fact that there's so many Western TNCs that they've been able to not portray, sorry, to display their ideology, which subtly influences people, and again, influence helps a superpower maintain its power or help spread its ideology. All right, so that's the end of part one. Be sure to go watch part two, which will be dropping quite soon, and watch out for the Anki flashcards that will pop up maybe in the next video. So yeah, stay tuned for that, and I'll see you guys in the next one.